captain in law enforcement in Nevada. He was also a teacher for 16 years. His grandmother came from Kansas. Both Natalie and Jim are authors. Jim's book is of his father's survival as POW in World War II, titled No Surrender. Natalie's book of 8 stories teach Proverbs with fun and adventure, titled Here's How That Happened, Volume 1 and 2. Welcome, Martha and Jim.
Morning. George. Morning, Dave.
Morning.
Oh, and share with here the people that have been experiencing the great experiment. Here we are. Martha was born, I was born in 31, June 2nd, 1731. And my George, which you'll learn of later, was born 8 months later, so we were close in age. But at the moment, when I was born, my mother gave us our education. And it was very important to learn reading and writing, and not very many girls did learn that. But my mother was able to teach me so many things in terms that I needed later on in life when I became a businesswoman. You see, I had 8 children, siblings under me. Some I was very close to, and many times, as throughout life, they were at my house. And we always had many people in our house coming and going in gatherings. But we were taught horseback riding and needlepoint, of course, and housekeeping. It was so important to do the domestic thing that I might be able to serve and do well with what I was given in life. So as I grew and became of age of 19, I met this charming Daniel Custis, and he was maybe 20 years older, but not that, didn't seem like he was that much older than I was, but he was a charming and gentle and kind man. However, his father was not so kind. And when Daniel proposed to me, his father was not about to have it. You see, Daniel being that much older than myself, he had already proposed to 2 other women before. But his dad, well, they were the richest people in Virginia. They had 17,500 acres of land and 5 plantations. And so he wasn't about to have Daniel marry someone that might end up having this if Daniel were to pass before myself. But I was able to have some communication with him. I think I was graced by Providence to be able to communicate well with people. And so maybe it was raising these siblings underneath me as well. Well, I persuaded Mr. Custis to allow myself to marry Daniel. Although he passed a year before we were married, and he gave away much that he didn't want me to have. But nonetheless, Daniel was a lovely husband, and we had 4 children. 2 of them passed before Daniel. We were married 7 years, and when Daniel passed, I had 2 very small children, very toddler type children, and I was left with this 17,500 acres of land, of which I understand some of it is Arlington National Cemetery today. But I was to be quickly brought into the world of business and trading with the British with the tobacco, and I soon had to make my name known that I was now the proprietor of this land, not Daniel. And of course I had a few suitors following. And in 2 years, my friends, Chamberlains, well, they knew of a colonel that had been very successful in the militia and in the French and Indian War, and so it was that they made an arrangement for a gathering in their home. You know, we had many gatherings at different places. We were of the Burgess House, and they weren't meeting so much, but they were gathering so that we would continue to know what was happening among us and in our colonies. I had seen this general man, well, he was colonel at that time. I had seen him in growing up, but I'd never talked with him, you know. But I did not know that they were making this arrangement. But we were at this gathering, and I was ready to go home. And they kept saying, no, wait, now, Mr. Chamberlain's on his way, and he said, got a friend with him. Well, when George walked in, I knew immediately. We both were a little bit blushing, knowing that this was a setup. But we engaged in conversation quickly, and before we knew it, there was another hour gone and another hour gone, and the horsemen and the carriage outside did not plan on staying so long, so many hours, but we talked into the evening. And when George left, I said, Mr. Washington, if you please to come back and visit and carry on some more conversation, that would be fine. We did so. I thought he'd be back in 2 to 3 months, but he was back in 2 weeks. And it was a long story short, we were married January 6th, the Epiphany, which is a renewal time, a perfect time of date to be married. And we were married at the White House, which is what we called Daniel Custis's home. The 17,500 acres was the White House, and we were married there. George left and came up to Mount Vernon. He had just received the living in Mount Vernon from his niece, who went ahead and got married. And earlier on, she had the house from his wonderful brother, Lawrence. George and Lawrence were very close, but Lawrence passed away. The niece got Mount Vernon, and then she gave it to my George. Well, there was not much furnishings in the Mount Vernon, and it was a 2-week ride with the wagons and with as much as I could bring. I heard that he was even asking for beds. So I brought as much as I could up to the Mount Vernon. And when I arrived with my 2 small children and all my helpers, well, the Potomac was beautiful, laid out before. And we many times spent many hours in the evenings sitting watching the Potomac as we were done with our day's duties. But we had a wonderful 15 years, 13, 15 years, and so on. And well, we were happily married the entire time we were married. But I say it in this manner is because the Stamp Act came in around 1764, and Mr. Hanson, Mr. Morris, of whom you've already met earlier on, that I was graced to be able to have our friend Mr. Morris visit us today. And this is when Mr. Morris and my George became friends, because Mr. Morris was such a good financial person that he was very concerned over the Stamp Act and began to inquire in the Burgess house of what was happening and staying abreast of the things that were going on. And I enjoyed meeting Mr. Morris's wife, Mary White Morris. Well, I'll tell you more about that later. But the time went by, and my children were growing, and little Patsy, which was Martha, but I called her Patsy, and John were my children that were growing. About 1773 came along the Boston Tea Party. It was the same year that my Patsy passed away. She had had the seizures. I'm so sorry about this. She had had the seizures. And so was that the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre and things, well, the colonies were becoming more and more taxed without representation. It was unbearable. The oppression, you know, when the Burgess House started in Jamestown, it was good, and they were organized for government, and they gave us freedom and so forth. But eventually now, 150 some years later, we're helping to pay off their debt of their war over in Britain. And so George walked into the Burgess House with all his regalia, and they knew his military regalia meant there was war, 1775. And by 1776, we know that Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence. I was also in Philadelphia at that time with George, and I could not be in Philadelphia because of the smallpox. The smallpox was rampant around Boston and around the Philadelphia area. during that time. And so we were inoculated, but that was quite was a disconcerting time. I wasn't sure to have John or George inoculated. You know, you never know if you're going to live or die after you get that inoculation. But George and John did get inoculated, and then they told me afterwards. They said they would have told me had he died, but they lived through it fine, and it was to my blessing that they did. By all means, Providence was always at my side, and I would rise every morning reading the Word of God and praying from 9 to 10 every morning. I was raised as a child to do this, and so we did. And in 76 and 77, Valley Forge was not such a military, was not such as we think of fighting and guns. It was more political. The Valley Forge was more of a political time. But it was grueling, and the holes in the men's shoes. And well, George implored me to come and to bring as much goods as I can. And during the summertime, I would can and I would dry the food and so forth. And then I'd come down, and so did so many other women come down and help with the men. There was about 12,000 men in each encampment, and many times there was up to 2,000 women in each encampment, and they would bring their goods as well. George was the general of the army, but I believe I was the general of the dinner. So they wanted me to come. George asked the Continental Congress to provide funds for me to come because I was such a military necessity. We did endure a great deal of suffering through this time, but I was more pressed upon to make my George as comfortable as possible. If the general is comfortable, then it will weed down through the time to the other men. And it was such a gaiety time, though. We did have one time where we danced through the night. I danced with Nathaniel Greene's wife because the French had brought in the alliance to us, and the French were now fighting with us. And it was a great time of gaiety and so forth. Well, I can't go into every battle, but Yorktown came around. And Yorktown was, of course, the ending time of the battle. But, you know, again, Mr. Morris and Mary White Morris, your wife, did such a pleasant, beautiful job of the dinner. She was so graceful, and she gave us an elegant way of living. She knew how to do hospitality, which was so important to me. This was one of my most important things, was the hospitality. And so they had a dinner for General George and the French general at that time, just before the Yorktown battle. And that was such a memorable, good experience with you all. And we will see you again when I become First Lady. I will have you talk with us a little more. But the Yorktown was over, the celebration was on, and we went to New York, and there was parades and shotguns and so forth. And I began having a little issue with the gallbladder, so I stayed in New York. But George went on, and he began helping tie up ends for the ending of the war. And I did get back down to Mount Vernon. We were so elated to be able to go back to Mount Vernon, but he had so many issues to deal with now. I said, please come by Christmas Eve. And he did. He got there by Christmas Eve. He brought my thimble that I had been asking for, and something for John. But as a matter of fact, it was for our grandchildren. We have 2 grandchildren from John. John passed away at the Yorktown. So I had outlived my first husband and 4 children by the end of the Revolutionary War. And so it was that the years went by, that now the colonies are united, and we're calling it the United States. Mm-hmm. And they had won the war, but within themselves they could not govern. there was the waterways, and there was the boundaries, and there was different money from one to and another, and what to use and how to. There needed to be an organizer, a president. And so finally, George relented. I was not so happy about it, but again, we were involved to be a president, and he was unanimously elected. It took some time for the votes to go down through the colonies and to come back to New York, but he was unanimously elected, and he was inaugurated as President George Washington. I was at Mount Vernon. I then took my entourage of children, people, and we traveled up to New York with some fanfare through the time of getting there. And we arrived at the Hudson River. And when we arrived at the Hudson River, it was a gay day. Across the river were all the Continental Congress, some of them, and of course George and many of our people that had written the Declaration and so forth. And there was a great fanfare of 13 gun salute and Lady Washington, and I was brought across the board. I am so sorry. Maybe I should just not take this on, huh?
Will it go lower?
Quit moving around.
I knew that we were of aristocracy, but I did not. This works. That I did not want to flaunt it. I wanted to stay low key, and I hope my hair will stay in place. I became a first lady, which of course they did not call me first lady then. The first lady that was called first lady was the wonderful Dolly Madison, who was much younger than myself. But of course her husband writing the Constitution during this time was quite important. And so we were in New York for a year and a half, and then we came down to Philadelphia, where our Robert Morris lived
Good morning.
with Mary.
Hi, so glad to see everybody. Mrs.
Can
Washington,
you all hear him?
it's been so long
It's been a long time.
since Yorktown. I was there when the general was putting the plans together to fight the British in the last battle of the Revolution.
Can you all hear him? Okay. You were there when they were putting the plan. Yes. Oh my. Well, you had so much involvement. How is Mary anyway?
Oh, Mary is great.
Mhm.
She's such a strong woman. I
Yeah,
am
she
so
is.
proud of her.
Yes.
And the friendship that we have with you and the general.
And the dinner you made, and she knew how to do dinners and how to do hospitality. In fact, I heard that when Mary would walk by the house and walk by one of the windows, the people outside, if they saw her, they would applaud. They'd stand there and applaud for Mary.
That is
She
correct.
was such a help to us and a confidant to myself as well. Did you sign just the Declaration of Independence or
Well,
anything else?
I had the honor of not only signing that document, but also when the constitutional was the ratification, I signed that and the Articles of Confederation. I was one of 3 men who signed all 3 documents.
That's remarkable. Well, you deserve to do that. You had so much involvement with our war. We would not have won the Revolutionary War without his financing. And you had 7 houses, and you gave us one to live in for 8 years.
Yes, well, it was Providence that blessed me. I'm a businessman, I'm a merchant, and Providence blessed me so much. And when the general said he needed help for his army, food, guns, everything, I helped him out. And that was definitely Providence.
Yes, we got through the war with your financing, and thank you so much, so much. Is there anything else you would have tell us about what you're saying?
Well, I did towards the end of my life. I made some poor decisions.
Well,
As a
that was
businessman,
about 1797.
I
Who
was-
would have thought that we should have land? It was a good investment to invest in land.
the frontier was open.
Yes.
And I thought, and it was suggested by some of my confidants, to purchase land. I bought millions of acres, thinking that the new country, we're a new nation, that some of those folks would move west.
And buy the land.
And that didn't happen. And I ended up in big trouble.
Yes.
There was an investigation, and I was put in debtor's prison for
Debtor's prison.
3 years.
Mary was quite
Horrible.
upset and confidant. We talked at length.
But I'm so
I
glad.
asked Mary to come to live in Mount
Yes.
Vernon.
Yeah, I was so happy that you were asking her to do that.
She wanted to stay where you were, and she did visit you every day
Yes.
for 3 years.
Yes.
And then you lived another 5 years, I believe.
That's correct.
Yes. Thank you, Mark. Robert. That would be towards the end of our lives as well. You see, after George was president, and oh my, all those years, forming a democracy and forming all the offices and so forth. Well, at any rate, 1797 was a very happy day year for us, that he was no longer president, and he would not be king. They wanted him to be king, some of them, but he was not about to do that. He wanted the people to have their way, and the people to have their votes, and he was not one to flaunt himself, nor was I. We were most happy to return back to Mount Vernon. And you know, another one that was not a flaunter is Thomas Jefferson. He didn't even have on his tombstone that he was a president. But at any rate, indeed, we had 2 more years after George was done with the presidency and came back to Mount Vernon and enjoyed himself. Of course, he still has to go visit John Adams and see what's going on, and so forth. But for the most part, we were having a wonderful time. He went out fox hunting. He loved the fox hunting, and I had gatherings, many gatherings, usually Thursdays, Fridays, and sometimes Tuesdays. Various different people. Some people could come when it was open to the public, so to speak, just to make sure you were dressed well to come. And I had a gathering, and he was out fox hunting and in the rain, and came in, and he did not change his clothes. He was wet, and we had our dinner. And the next day, he had a sore throat, and he truly suffered the last 2 months of his life. And now I had lost my sisters, my children, my husband's. I did not go to the funeral, but I lived 2 more years, and I went upstairs to the 3rd floor. George had done so much for the Mount Vernon, but I want to say thank you to you for living in what we were hoping would end up being a great experience and experiment. And you are that. Thank you. And we